Does it mean that if people are searching more for Google Translate, that we'll have fewer translation jobs in those specific regions? Well, I'm about to examine a paper that says that it does. And I'm going to break it down and we're going to go through it. It's going to be great. Stick with me for the full video because this is going to be a very interesting ride. So the paper that we're analyzing, it was published in Vox EU in March 22nd this year. It's entitled Lost in Translation, AI's Impact on Translators and Foreign Language Skills. So it's trying to assert the impact of AI on translators and foreign language skills. It was written by Carl Benedict Frey, Dieter Schwartz, Associate Professor of AI and Work at Oxford Internet Institute, University of Oxford, and Pedro Llanos Paredes, Postdoctoral Research Officer, Oxford Martin School, University of Oxford. Very grateful for them for publishing this, and now it's time to kick into it. So what this paper is saying, and the main finding, and I've highlighted this, is that the authors find that areas with higher adoption of Google Translate, and that means where people are searching more for Google Translate, experienced a decline in translator employment. The authors also show that improvements in machine translation have reduced the demand for foreign language skills in general. So in plain English, they're saying that people searching more for the term Google Translate means that there are fewer job opportunities. That's the hypothesis in language, right? And first off, they cite something that I find very off and weird. Citing a 2024 survey found that over 3/4 of translators expect, this is the key word, expect generative AI to adversely affect their future incomes, while others even question the enduring value of language skills. I really wonder what this subjective survey, how this could be of any value to this claim that there is a correlation between the search for Google Translate and less jobs. All this survey is saying is that a lot of translators are very, very scared. 75% of them, in fact, and I'm not questioning the legitimacy of them being scared, but that's what this survey is measuring. It's not measuring at all whether or not this impacts the market. It just shows that they're scared, right? So that's just important to put that out there. Now to the meat of it, right? They're saying that searches for Google Translate spiked around this time, and this was around what the time that they're referring is around 2010, while queries for translator declined correspondingly. So in figure 1, and this is a pretty interesting figure, right? It's showing the searches for translator in blue versus the searches for Google Translate in red. And you can clearly notice that there's an inflection point between 2010 and 2015. This looks like around 2012. The inflection point is when the searches for translator become smaller than the searches for Google Translate. The other thing that's interesting to note, typical of tech adoption, you see this nice J-curve here where Google Translate just picked up and was adopted very quickly from 2008 more or less to 2012, right? There was this enormous adoption curve. It continued, but then you see some oscillations and things like that. And nonetheless, the search for translator diminished, right? And this is really good data, by the way. The problem with this data is that it's presupposing, this is the basic assumption, it's presupposing that because people are searching for Google Translate, they're not searching for the word translator. And maybe that assumption makes a lot of sense for a given context. So let's say I'm a person and I'm trying to read a document on the internet that was published in German. Now I have Google Translate. I'm going to use Google Translate to try to read the document for sure. I'm not going to hire a professional translator. I'm not going to spend a bunch of money on that. But that's me as a person. And who searches for this? This is typically individuals. We surveyed, for instance, over 104 of our customers of BureauWorks, and all of them confirmed that when they require translation, they go to their preferred vendors, they go to their procurements, they go to their agencies of record to work with. They're not searching in Google who should be a good translator for this file. And what's important is the main driver for the translation economic sector, for all its growth, for all its money, are large companies. They're the ones who are driving content. They're the ones who are localizing their user manuals, their websites, their legal terminology in literally sometimes up to hundreds of languages. They're the ones who are driving up the demand for the market. The average Joe like me, who's just needing to translate a web page for my own understanding, or maybe, figure out something here or there, I'm the one who's going to be on Google, and I'm the one who's going to stop looking for a translator. I'm going to use Google Translate for those purposes. So maybe from a search volume perspective, yeah, it's me, the average Joe, that's going to impact this graph. But from what it really matters, which is a revenue driving perspective, the search for translators does not take place over Google. The search for translator takes place over scrutinous processes driven by procurement people, driven by Fortune 500, 2000 companies, by Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D companies that are really driving this growth in content and at multilingual scale, and they're not doing it for the most part through Google searches. And if anything, maybe they'll do a simple Google search at the beginning of their selection process just to see what's out there as far as agencies and providers, but they're not going to continuously be searching on the internet for providers, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong with this data. I mean, it's beautiful. The data itself is right? But the finding is presupposing something that's just not right from an economic perspective. When we continue to go down through this paper, and by the way, I recommend that everybody reads this fully. Now we see another map, and it says this map reports the 2023 to 2023 log change in internet searches for Google Translate across local labor markets. So this is in the US, and what this map is basically saying is that the regions in red saw that the search for Google Translate increased, versus the regions in blue, the search for Google Translate increased less, right? So the log, the smaller the number, the greater the increase, the bigger the number, the smaller the increase. And it's also, we notice a very clear correlation here. Places where you have more people who speak more languages, places like California, places like Florida, places like Texas, where Spanish is so common, for instance, or California, where so many different languages are so common. Places like New York, for instance, these places experienced a lot more search for Google Translate than other places that don't have such a high demand for requiring things in different languages. Now, what they're saying here is that they're saying that these findings indicate that regions with greater use of Google Translate experienced a growth slowdown in translator and interpreter jobs. Maybe that's true. Maybe it is true. I'm not questioning, not disputing the finding itself. What I do dispute is the fact that, first, translator and interpreter jobs, most translator and interpreter jobs, they're freelance-based. And because the market is very mature at this stage, most agencies, for instance, they already have their freelance pools very well consolidated. They're going to show, they're going to create job postings here and there if they get a very large project into a given language, if they get demand that's not being met well for a given language pair. Yes, then they'll put out maybe an ad for, I need an English into Swahili translator, for instance. But in general, most of these agencies are really well staffed. The boom for translator ads is long past us. This happened between the mid-90s to early 2010s, right? We're at a later stage of globalization maturity where these ads are not nearly as frequent as when they were. They're not nearly as proportional to the amount of volume that's being translated. More so than that, the other thing that happens from an economic perspective is that as, for instance, the US GDP, for instance, grew tremendously in this period between 2010 to 2023, whereas the GDP in other places in the world didn't grow necessarily as much. And what that means is, from an economic power perspective, it will make a lot more sense. For instance, typically it will be a lot less expensive to find a translator for Vietnamese in Vietnam than it will be to find a translator for Vietnamese in California. It will be a lot less expensive typically to find a translator for Brazilian Portuguese in Brazil than it will be, for instance, in Florida. So, and that's also correlated with this rise in globalization. It has become easier to work with people across borders. It has become easier to hire these people, whether through freelance portals, whether through agencies. This entire commingling of the global translator community has become something with less barriers, right? And that's also something that we need to take into account. So it's not because these job postings reduced at the state level while the search for the Google Translate increased, what this could actually be showing is that there's actually more demand for language and more demand for things to be understood in different languages, not necessarily that there are fewer jobs in general across the world about this. So important distinctions here. And what they're saying is that cumulatively, this effect translates into an estimated loss of about 28,000 new translator positions that might otherwise have been created over the 13-year period. So over 13 years in the US, again, let's point this out, this is in the US, 28,000 new translator jobs, they estimate, weren't created. But who's to say that these 28,000 translator jobs weren't created in other places in the world? So again, when we look at these studies, it's very important to look at the behavior at a worldwide global scale and not isolate at a given country, particularly when that country is so prone to global outsourcing. Now, the next phase here says, our analysis of millions of job postings across local labor markets shows that regions with high MT adoption experience lower growth in job advertisements requiring foreign language skills. Okay, so again, they're correlating job postings with actual economic activity. It's very easy to demystify this. Like I said in the agency example, we could see an agency that's operating maybe tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in outsourcing a year that has maybe just a few job postings here and there. Why? Because their freelance pool is already consolidated. They've already been working with these people maybe for 10, 15 years for many of them. So they're not having to go to market for every single job. They have their rosters very well populated, very well staffed. They have information about them. They have all this data. They're not typically posting jobs about this. They're simply sending jobs to community or pools of translators who are taking them. So there's very little correlation between having more job postings and having more job activities. The other thing is that translation over these years became, as a general trend, less of a full-time thing and more as a freelance thing, particularly as technology evolved and allowed content to be shared and translated, distributed more easily, and removed some of these barriers with cloud computing, for instance. You no longer have this advantage necessarily of having in-house translators. Those advantages are at least diminished. So what they're saying is they're saying that this is true for all language pairs investigated. Areas with robust Google Translate usage saw job postings demanding Spanish fluency grow by 1.4% percentage points less than in other regions. Similarly, declines of roughly 1.3 and 0.8 percentage points for Chinese, German, respectively. And a measurable dampening even for Japanese and French. So we're measuring 1.4, 0.8. These are so small percentage points. I mean, if we think about what the margin of error for these measurements are, they're well within the margin of error. So these diminishing trends might as well be zero if you calculate their average margin of error. The truth is, they don't know, right? It's definitely not an open and shut case that this claim is true, right? That there is a correlation between less posts demanding bilingualism. And in fact, I would argue exactly the opposite. As machine translation becomes more prevalent, it's even more important to have people who speak multiple languages on the staff, because things need to be validated. Things need to be confronted. Things are going back and forth. And the argument here and they even make this argument, is that there's an economic benefit to machine translation because more trade will happen. We'll get to that in just a sec. But again, pretty easy to debunk this finding. They're saying overall our findings imply that as AI translation technology advances, the demand for bilingual skills is likely to continue its decline. Again, I challenge this vehemently. My opinion is that bilingualism will become even more important because it's not about understanding a certain document. It's actually a lot more about being able to interact with other people in language. So for instance, let's say I speak Spanish, right? Maybe, my neighbor who doesn't can understand the same document as me, but I can actually carry on a conversation full of nuance with other Spanish speakers. I can understand the culture. I can understand things that go beyond understanding a document. So there's tremendous value of being bilingual or trilingual or multicultural in any kind of society, even if we were past the point of singularity where AI was better than any human translating. Now, they're saying here that sharing a common language can boost bilateral trade by roughly 50%, right? So what they're saying is that if you diminish or remove entirely the cost of translation, you have an immense impact, positive impact on trade. And what's not here is that as you get more trade and as content gets better, and this is clearly the case, for instance, if we think about content in general, the demand for high quality content has only been increasing over the past 20, 30 years, right? If we think about what the demand for high quality content maybe was in the 1990s, let's say we're shipping software, as long as people could use the software, as long as there were no errors in the software, as long as the documentation was understandable, that was good. Now that's just the basic, that's just like the starting point. People want posts that they can engage with. They want things that resonate with them at a deep emotional level. They want to feel like they're a part of a community. So the demands for communication, they continue to increase. They're not static at all, right? And that also needs to be taken into account. And then you have all these ramifications also from an economic perspective, that as you have more trade, as you have more things taking place, what happens is that you have more people, more products being commercialized, more opportunities for people to need to interact with others in other languages. So even if you have higher machine translation adoption, you're still going to have more instances where things need to be validated, whether for regulatory reasons, compliance reasons, for potential addressing miscommunications. Things are going to be, the requirement for text is going to be higher. So it's not necessarily that just because you have better machine translation that you're going to have fewer opportunities for translation. Maybe these opportunities are going to be a lot more productive. Maybe they're going to be a lot faster. Maybe the requirements are going to be higher, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one extinguishes the other, right? So going back here to the text, they're saying tradable services are emerging as a new driver of economic growth, and that I agree with 100%. And they're saying here, by reducing language barriers, machine translation potentially enables billions of non-English speakers to participate in the global services marketplace, offering skills in engineering, design, marketing, consulting, and other areas. I also tend to agree with that. I think that's true. I mean, I think if I'm a designer, for instance, and I'm offering, I could work with someone in Japan because now it's no longer a barrier. Yeah, that would be great. I still think that beyond the language barriers, there are huge cultural barriers. There are other kinds of barriers that are not just in the language itself. So I do dampen this claim significantly, even though I think it's not dead wrong. So this is a really interesting read, at least it was for me. I think it has a few interesting data points, but for me, most importantly, our market, the translation market, is a very specific market. It's very niched, and the behavior fundamentally is all about what large companies do because they're the big producers of content. And even if you, in large companies, whether it's for compliance reasons, like I mentioned, or whether it's just because the demand for higher and higher quality is getting bigger, it's not necessarily the case that machine translation will extinguish jobs. My personal opinion is that machine translation will require a whole new level of productivity, which it's been doing so. And this is another interesting thing, right? If you look at the curve again, you can see that this effect has been taking place and impacting the translation sector ever since maybe early 2006, right? So this isn't anything new, this rise of AI, at least for the translation world. This has been an ongoing trend for at least 20 years now, right? So this is something very sedimented in the space, and the space hasn't gone away. Some will argue, it's just because Google Translate hasn't gotten good enough. Well, I think Google Translate is actually really good at many, many things, but you still need, for so many different reasons, maybe you need an attorney to look at a contract that has been translated, assuming that it's perfect by machine translation. You still have adaptations that take place. You still have changes that are required. You still need, there are nuances in communication style, in branding, in how you address people, and formality. And you need, not only do you need platforms like BureauWorks to manage all of that, like all of that governance, but you also need people coming from agencies. You need freelancers. You need specialists who can manage to look at a file, for instance, and have a subject matter expert analyze it so that it doesn't consume the time of, let's say, a full-time executive looking at it. So, just as an example, it's going to be a lot less expensive typically if you have, let's say, a Japanese chemical patent first reviewed by a subject matter expert working as a freelancer in Japan, then signed off by someone in the executive team, than if you have it directly done by the executive team, because the cost of every minute of the executive team is so much higher than the cost of every minute of that potential freelancer, as specialized as they may be. So you went from an economic perspective, it will continue to make make sense to outsource. It will continue to make sense to rely on professionals, on translators who can either validate very specialized content or add a lot of value, a lot of creative value, a lot of expressive value to content, which is ever more important. So those are my thoughts on this study. I'm very grateful for the people who published it, and I would love to hear yours. Again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. If you liked, please remember to like and subscribe and leave your comments on the video below. All right, take care. Till the next one.